evening. Well, two things, first of all, before I introduce a bit more to you, Darren McGarvey. Firstly, to the organisers, although I said I would bring my phone up here to keep an eye on the time, I've forgotten. So if you can wave at me when we're about 45 minutes in so that we can start to take questions. The second thing, as the introduction of me was being read out there, when it got to the bit where it said she worked with 5 UK Prime Ministers, I, maybe a bit too lightheartedly, said to Darren, that's trauma. Which is a story for another night. I'm thrilled to be here tonight with Darren McGarvey. Darren and I first met, I think, in the 2014 Scottish independence referendum, and it's fair to say a lot of water has gone under the bridge for both of us since those days. Darren, author of 3 books, Poverty Safari, best-selling, also the winner of the Orwell Prize in 2018, so huge success. The Social Distance Between Us, the second of Darren's books, and of course the one we're here to talk about tonight, Trauma Industrial Complex, which is a brilliant book. Really interesting, thought-provoking, lots in it that I agree with, but more than that, lots in it that has made me challenge my thinking and my preconceptions about things. So congratulations on its publication.
Thanks, Nicola, and thanks for agreeing to do this. I really appreciate it.
No, it's my pleasure. I thought I'd kick off, I guess, with when I started reading this book, I was expecting it to be the most, how would I describe it, scientific of your books. And there's a lot of science about trauma in here. But as I read it, I started to think that actually, even including Poverty Safari, it's the most personal of the 3 books you've written. It's, as well as talking about the science of trauma, the definitions of trauma, the impact of trauma, how people who tell their stories of trauma, some of these stories are how they're used and sometimes misused. It felt to me very much that this was you processing your own life, your own story. And I wondered, is that fair? Is that what this book became?
Yeah, it became that. It never started like that. I remember meeting with Andrew, my publisher, in 2022 and kind of pitching what at the time I thought was going to be a kind of a book that was going to provide a sort of meta commentary on what it's like to talk about your life publicly. And because I had always written about class, at first I wasn't so secure in the pitch and the idea, and therefore I wasn't able to pitch it clearly enough for other people to understand it. So I went away and reconsidered it and thought about it. Then I got to somewhere a bit closer to the ballpark that the first part of this, first section of this book is in, where it's a kind of analysis and cultural critique of the really important proliferation of trauma, the democratization of trauma. I think that's been much needed. People having a language and a lexicon to describe their experiences and relationships and communities. I mean, I come from a recovery community, with some of the most marginalised people in society, and they're armed with a new lexicon to talk about their feelings and emotions and experiences, and that's really great. But also we have the social media dimension of things, which I think sometimes can offer as many cons as it does pros. So it was very clear that coming from a place where I'm sympathetic to the analysis that trauma plays a wider role in social problems than maybe some people might, at the same time I thought if there is going to be a critique of this discourse, it'll be best to come from someone who is part of it, rather than from someone who has a kind of Piers Morgan kind of bedside manner, who approaches things almost sort of insensitive.
Piers Morgan does not have a bedside manner.
But that kind of that sort of thing where anyone who might have a point, it's undermined by the mean-spiritedness with which it's kind of delivered. But then, obviously, as I'm writing the book, life starts happening. And then what I'm aware of is I'm writing a book about how people storify trauma, and then my experience of writing this book is turning into a story in itself. And that's when I realised there's no escape from narrative, there's no escape from stories. your mind is just like a kind of, it's like a mold, and life is pouring into it, and out of that is coming a story no matter what. So I thought maybe the book could be about for people who are trying to find answers to questions related to trauma, about how they could practically begin to redraft their story in a way that maybe makes it ring a little truer than some of the Instagram influencers would be inspiring us to be.
Yeah, that's certainly when I was reading it, I got the strong sense that as you were writing it, the book had become more personal, and it was a reassessment and a rewriting in parts of the story you had previously told, the trauma in your childhood, how that had impacted your life, but that it also became a bit of an unburdening of yourself around the trauma or re-traumatizing of you through the telling of your story. And I don't know, I may be wrong, but I sort of sensed in the book and how you were dealing with this, a sense of, not that you should incidentally, but a sense of guilt that you told your story, that the impact that might have had on other people, a sense of, in telling the story you were telling, that you felt, again, I think wrongly, that you had been typecast almost as somebody with trauma. So there was a sense of, personal in that, as well as in the original trauma story that you told in Poverty Savari.
Yeah, exactly. And I think also as time passes, your experiences are contextualized by new experiences. Maybe some old wounds or resentments begin to fade. And also as you become a parent, which is what happened to me in the intervening time between book 1 and book 2, then you begin to empathise a little more than is maybe comfortable at first with the dilemmas that your parents faced when they were raising you. And so in a strange way, I felt more connected to my mother, for example, than I ever had when she was alive, because there are moments with children where there's a part of you, and I love my kids, and one day they might watch this and they'll understand my sense of humour, hopefully by then. There are moments in child rearing where I honestly just go like that to myself subconsciously. I know why she left, and that's not meant to be comedic. It's really just, there are moments where your needs conflict so much with the needs of others, and the needs of others always win 90% of the time when you're a parent with young kids. But there's that 10% where you're just like, no, I'm not going to play with you. No, I don't have time to listen to your whatever it is. No, I just need to be alone, or I just want to do what I need to do. And so as I'm writing the book, I'm realizing actually this can actually become a forum for something that is a bit more personal, but something that is balanced in the sense of, when we tell the story of our trauma, we're usually the victims, and there's usually good reasons for that. But as we go on our journey of recovery from trauma, we also recognise how our trauma has retransmitted onto people around us before we've gained the insight. And that part of the healing journey is about recognising that, and I wanted to model how someone might do that. Not batter them over the head with it, but say, I will go first, I will show you, and then maybe that will make it a bit more of an inviting process.
Yeah, I think that's a really powerful strand of the book. You write about how, people who have been traumatised go on to traumatise other people, hurt people, but that is a cycle that continues. And I guess, you've written in the past about poverty, social inequality, but was it a bit more daunting to write about trauma? Because although it's a personal book, you are also writing about trauma in a scientific sense, and obviously the impact of trauma on those traumatised is severe. There is, the clinical element to it. Did that put more of a responsibility on you to get this right? Did you have to do more research than you did for your previous books? Was it a tougher thing to write for that reason?
Well, actually, the research for this was not quite as challenging as it was for book 2, because I had in my mind for book 2, I wanted to kind of prove myself, as someone who didn't have to rely on their experience to make a book readable. Now, whether I succeeded in that endeavour or not, I can't say, because it's other people to make that decision. But actually, I felt that this process, this book, once it became clear to me that all I had to do was focus on this theme of storytelling, rather than offering a kind of a State of the Union type or comprehensive book that maybe someone who is actually an expert on mental health might write. I had to have the humility to recognise where it was appropriate for me to offer my opinion and observation on certain things outside of my own experience, and where it wasn't. And I think that's when that crystallised, that simplicity, it's a real gift when you're writing a book. Especially great notes as well from publishers and stuff like that, like structure. Things like a little sentence from someone can really help me to simplify my thinking, because I'm not saying that my thinking is complicated in a I'm so intellectual and intelligent way. My brain has just got so much stuff in it all the time. It's like a beehive. But there is a certain frequency that can cut through it all, and someone who really knows you well knows what tone to strike. And so when the simplicity of the storytelling theme started to come through, then I began to think, maybe this is a book where I can actually be more creative than I've been in the past, where actually I can write a book that critically engages the reader by shifting in and out of storytelling and then reminding the reader that they're reading a story. So it's a kind of, as I say, it's sort of Brechtian alienation almost that you might see in theatre, where you get immersed and then something happens to remind you that you're watching a play and that you've got to critically engage with the themes. And I really wanted the reader at points in the journey of the book to question what they were reading and to question their relationship with the text. In a way that, I hope works for the reader and is dynamic, and for me it was very creatively satisfying, because there's the argument and the polemic itself, and there's the memoir element of it, but I really think I started to develop a confidence in myself in terms of how the book would play out in terms of its structure, and for me that was the big achievement from a writing perspective.
I think you succeeded in that. The book, for those who haven't read it yet, and hopefully everybody will read it after tonight, it is extremely readable. You take a complex subject that could be very easy to write it in a way that's impenetrable, but through relating it to your personal story, make it very accessible. So I think that is something you do very successfully, and that element of storytelling, I think, helps take the reader along with you. I mean, certainly, you made me think afresh about trauma in certain respects. One of the things that I think comes across really strongly is, the idea of trauma is not the thing that happens to you, it's the impact that it then has on you. And one of the themes of the book, of course, is the expanding definition of trauma. And I'm just going to read it. You give a definition, well, it's not yours, it's from a psychologist called Miriam Taylor. Trauma is the imprint of an event, situation, or relationship that threatens our survival and overwhelms our capacity to cope on our own. But one of the points you're making is that we've moved, or are moving, substantially away from that quite focused definition, and now we live in a society where somebody has a bad day and they describe it as, I'm traumatized, or something relatively trivial happens. But that's not exclusive or unique to trauma. We medicalize the stresses and strains of life quite easily now, and describe things that when I was growing up were just the stresses of being a teenager as mental health. So this is a wider concept, and I wondered, you maybe want to say a bit more about your views of that, but also just the question I would pose to you is, in recognising that phenomenon, and you address this quite well in the book, I think, but isn't that, even although there's lots of problems with that, is that not still better than what used to be the case, where we suppressed or didn't recognise trauma and stress and mental health? Absolutely.
And part of how I draw the reader in to that is by being honest about me wrestling with that. There was a point in the process of writing the book where I was interviewing people, partly having events, because I really wanted to engage the public before I completed the book. I didn't want to go away and write and think I'm confident enough to come to all these conclusions on my own. So the book, and the tone of the book in particular, benefited immensely from engagement with people with lived experience and experts. And one of the two key takeaways that I got from one event, actually, Suzanne Zedek, James Docherty, both very prominent voices in the ACES movement in Scotland. And they could see that I was becoming agitated by some of the more, I don't know, some of the takes on trauma that might be characterised as a bit over the top, right? Now, even that can be a provocative thing to say. You don't know what someone's been through. But for talking's sake, let's say I myself had descended a bit of a rabbit hole and I was getting a bit agitated by people talking about trauma in a way that I thought was diluting it. And Suzanne and James at the event, they kind of brought me back to a place of reasonableness about this by reminding me what the alternative was, which is what you're alluding to here, which is suppression, or a kind of hierarchy of trauma, where this is traumatic, but this isn't traumatic. And that is actually the history of trauma, and that is the conditions in which trauma becomes likelier to occur. Particularly institutional types of trauma. And so that really unlocked a lot of things for me, because there's a point in the book where I'm having that realization, and that's real. That's real. That's me being brought back to a state of reasonableness about the issue, because it could have been a different book. It could have been kind of agitated, angry Darren who wrote the book. And you know what? That might have found a lucrative audience in this current climate. But there's something about I'm fortunate in the fact that I will always go back and reflect. And so the book benefited from coming at it in a more even-handed and sensitive way.
I thought that was actually one of the most powerful sections in the book. The discussion you had with Suzanne and James, two people I know quite well too, but that backwards and forwards where you're testing your own views, allowing your views to be challenged, but also pushing back a bit on them and arriving at this kind of more balanced view. I thought that was really powerful. But it was also kind of, testing the form of these kind of books as well, where you're having the debate on the page, which again, I think makes it really interesting and accessible for the reader.
Yeah, and also because people are naturally very sensitive or apprehensive to be seen in any way invalidating or dismissing people who have trauma, it also sometimes means that some of our assumptions and precepts of our thinking aren't challenged in a way that where we can become kind of lazy in our thinking. So a lot of the assumptions around trauma, they're being disputed as we speak. And there's a battle of ideas happening in publishing just now between the kind of the body keeps the score version of trauma and the body absolutely does not keep the score version of trauma, and these ideas are all legitimately kind of being played out. So I thought if I could contribute something other than that for the reader, whose background I can only never know, but I also wanted to kind of subtly say to the movement that I come from, the one that's trying to raise awareness of trauma, the one that's trying to make sure that gets baked into how we deal with poverty, educational attainment, drug crisis, all of these different things, that we stay sharp and we stay aware of the fact that not everyone who disagrees with us wants to invalidate people with trauma. They have ideas that we need to listen to and constantly be testing our own ideas against.
So here's the bit of the book that gave me a bit of whiplash, I guess, and really made me go, whoa, because as a policymaker, a legislator, the leader of a government for many years, for much of my time in government, I was being challenged, my government was being challenged to listen to people with lived experience, to make sure that the voice of lived experience was central to policy making from the very, very early stages right through to implementation. I'm pretty sure at times in years gone past, you were challenging us to do that as well. And yet, in the book, and you'll correct me if I'm overstating this, you seem to be saying that's maybe going a bit too far, and we're allowing the voice of lived experience too much prominence, and we need to hear more from the experts and the academics and the scientists again. And it can't, presumably it can't be either or. How do we, am I getting what you're saying right? And if so, how do we get the balance right? Because it's got to be both.
Yeah, it does. These have to work in tandem. I think what I try to put across in the book is, first of all, taking a lot of time to outline why lived experience is important, where this concept of lived experience comes from. It's feminist standpoint theory. It's a kind of evolution of that. It's the totally uncontroversial idea that people who have gone through a particular thing may possess insights that people who haven't don't. And anywhere that lived experience informs policy in a long-term way, where lived experiences are surveyed at some kind of scale, then it tends to have a positive impact. But what's happened is that we've slipped into a kind of mode, partly just due to the incentives culturally. Some of the incentives were how organisations obtain or secure longer-term funding, and also the very necessary pendulum swing from no voices from marginalised communities to more voices from marginalised communities, and the optics of being seen to platform those voices, which I commend and agree with for the most part. But what it also means is that a lot of people are platformed, not necessarily just on the basis of their experience and what insights we might gain, but because they possess certain skills, like being clear communicators, like being kind of largely compliant within whatever the parameters are in any given organisation, or that their experience is one of the experiences which is kind of politically or culturally in vogue at that particular moment. And so what can happen is you've got a bunch of people who listen to one person and their subjective interpretation of their experience at a particular point in their life, and they then think that one person is a key to understanding everyone in that demographic subconsciously. Sometimes that might work really well, but where policy formation comes into play, if we aren't also doing that survey at scale, and I talk about the kind of the civil service interviews with the long-term unemployed before the Beveridge report was produced, and how that form of surveying lived experience was immensely useful, because all those families were different. They had different experiences of poverty. Some of them might have had alcoholism, some of them were Tories, some of them were Labour. But no matter what their personal differences were, survey enough of them at scale and themes will emerge, the main one being, no matter how much money these people have, they can't make it last a week. So we have to create a system of social insurances to make sure people don't fall through the floor of society. And I think maybe we've moved away from that kind to prioritise the more palatable, entertaining, engaging kind. And so it was just trying to kind of redress that imbalance.
Yeah, I mean, I think it is about where do you strike the right balance, because at the end of the book you kind of make some recommendations for how people who tell their story, who give their lived experience, should be, better supported and, better remunerated, rewarded for what they do. And I guess that's possibly the only thing I would say when I was reading it. I thought, is there a contradiction here? Because, of course, everybody should be paid for what that they do and given speeches and such like. But if people who are telling their own story, if it becomes almost a profession or a job, does that not actually then risk what you're talking about, that they have the wrong incentives to say things that are, overly dramatic in order to get the work and get the gigs that they need? Yes,
I think obviously that risk is there, but the same could be applied to the academics who are paid to study them, or the politicians who are paid to advocate for them or represent them. So, obviously in specific cases, then maybe a kind of monetary incentive should be removed just for the purposes of making sure that things are ethical. For example, maybe in journalism, where someone is, given a story or there's some kind of news report. But even then, there are certain things to which a person who's offering a story should be entitled. And that is maybe in some circumstances a bit of insight into how they're going to be presented afterwards. The amount of people that I deal with, and something that's really informed my journalism over the years, is the people who talk to media, they're charmed by a journalist. The journalist might be sincere in how they want to portray the situation sympathetically, but then the story gets fed up the food chain to an editor who's more objective and dispassionate, and they decide how it's framed. And very often, a person who's vulnerable, who's told the story for good reasons, goes home to find that they have been portrayed in a way that makes a mockery of them and their experience. So even if you're not saying, okay, well, here's 30 quid for talking to us, you could say, well, let's bat it back and forth. Here's how I was thinking about framing the story. Do you feel okay with that? No, I'm okay because I'm confident enough to advocate for myself in that regard. And even just once you have a bit of social status, or once you're seen as someone in air commas, success, journalists you won't need to ask a journalist to do that. That's something a journalist is going to do unless they're after you. But for someone who doesn't even know or have the self-esteem or confidence to even think that they might be entitled to ask a journalist, how are you going to write about me? You know, they can get lost in that process. So the book's really kind of trying to say, let's move the needle a little bit and remember that when we tell people stories, we often do it because we have concern about public safety. But in the process of doing that, we undermine the safety of the individuals sometimes who are the subject of our stories, and that should be informing journalists all the time.
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the central themes you talk about, which I think is really, really powerful, is the impact on people who put their head above the parapet and tell their story. And it's often an impact they don't foresee. They think it's part of a healing process when often it turns out to be the opposite, and that's without the exploitation, the sort of abuse of the system that, you know, puts them out there and then doesn't support them. I mean, you write about that very personally from your own perspective, and, you know, I came away from reading the book thinking, you know, that whole process for you has been a pretty bruising one. Is that fair? And do you think your story or that experience, if that is fair, is that representative, do you think, or is that more unique to you?
I think for people who get to the kind of level of having elevated visibility, whatever that might look like, there will be ways, that, the way that I describe it in the book, that the trauma snaps back at you. So you might be unguarded in terms of talking about your situation at some point. No, I'm very aware this is a kind of niche community, but it's a community nonetheless, and it's a workforce that's operating largely in a regulation vacuum, right? So part of the book is to remind people who do that, you know, you're part of a workforce, you have the right to ask for certain basic things to be met, certain conditions. Now, my experience, I take responsibility for all of the repercussions of telling my story, because I think ultimately, once you've kind of thought it through and done all the inventory on it, when I chose to tell my story, the only thing I didn't understand was how successful the first book would be. So the book was written for kind of local people. It's full of references to, like, from your perspective, very obscure community minutiae. To me, these are big, big things. Do you know what I mean? The Pollock Free State.
Pollock Park. You know?
Exactly. These are big, big, you know, milestones in my life and my political development. But then the book did what it did. And suddenly I remember, and I describe it in the book, sitting with Cathy Newman in London, and the first question she asked, to which she's quite entitled to, was the references to one of the incidents involving my mother. And I was on the defensive straight away, you know, and I thought of my dad, and I thought of my family, and I thought, oh shit, I thought they were going to ask me about that lovely chapter I wrote about libraries. You know, here was me thinking I was writing this book that was like so specific and that working class people could not fail but connect with it. And the stuff that made the headlines was the stuff that I didn't really realise was going to be the kind of media catnip. So for me to take responsibility for that, then I think that is important, but also other people could be more cautious. Your story is your story, your interpretation is your interpretation, but the minute that becomes public domain, as you know from many facets of your varied career at this point, it's not yours anymore. It is a commodity, and if you're still traumatised and you don't know it, when it snaps back at you, you will feel that, and it will reverberate through you. And you know, if you've got community around you that can support and attune to you, good. But if you're on your own, like I was or felt back in those days, then, you know, you can end up in a real mess.
Yeah. No, I mean, having just published a memoir, I totally identify with that. I mean, your story is your story, but it impacts on lots of other people's stories, and the things you think will be of most interest to people it's often other things that people will pick up on. And that actually leads me, this book is about trauma, but it's actually, when you read it, it is as much a sort of commentary on modern society, or media culture, for example. So when you write about the impact of, you know, people with trauma telling their stories, you know, sharing their lived experience of putting themselves out into the public domain, subjecting themselves to public scrutiny, even although I'm not somebody, you know, with trauma, that resonated with me. And so it's part of the media culture we live in. The media, you know, chews people up and spits them out. So I guess it's my way of saying, you can read this book to learn more about trauma and the impact of trauma, but actually it's also a reflection of modern society.
Yeah, and in particular, this sort of digital period where almost experiences are coveted and valuable, but also highly disposable. And I think that one of the ways that social media feeds on us is that it invites us to think of ourselves almost like products, and our views and experiences as kind of brand extensions. It's that kind of neoliberal ideology that gets written into our DNA. Well, we don't even realise it, but when we're out and about, even if we're not in the public eye, we kind of hold ourselves in a way that as if an audience is watching us. There's this awareness of other people's thoughts and opinions about us. And I mean, how much stuff do we post on social media just because we see that other people have done it, and then we think, well, that must be the thing that we do. And what we're really doing is creating a projection, which is not completely false, but there is quite some distance, usually, for most of us, between that projection and the reality of our lives behind the curtain. And in that sense, I think that when we step into that domain with really intimate experiences that we haven't even made sense of ourselves yet, and we buy into this idea that we might experience catharsis or upcycle adversity into some kind of meaning, then we may require further guidance before doing that. And it's okay, you know, say someone breaks up with you, or you're going through some hard time, mental health issue, you know, I'm having a hard time, and that's kind of normal, you know, that social media can be good for that. But I've been to men's groups where one guy was sharing what he was saying. He was talking about how he was going to disclose his suicide attempt on Facebook. And it was in his past, but he hadn't told any of his family about it. I was like, have you told anyone? He's like, no. And I was like, well, can I say something? And he was like, cool. And I was like, I've got experience of this. And I think, what would some of your family maybe not a bit upset that they're finding out about this at the same time as a lot of people on Facebook who don't know you? I mean, I know it's your experience and you want to share it, but maybe you should talk to your family first and see what they think, you know. But that part of us that would normally maybe do that, it just short circuits now to social media straight away, and so we don't consider the repercussions.
Yeah, I mean, I definitely, you know, certainly in my world, but more generally, there's a sense in the climate we live in today that if you don't Instagram it or tweet it or put it out that it hasn't actually happened, it's almost given it, you know, legitimacy by doing that. I mean, I guess that's one of the paradoxes of this book, a positive paradox. You're writing about the dangers, particularly for people with trauma, in opening yourself up without really understanding the consequences and the impact of that. And yet you open yourself up in this book, certainly more than I'm aware of you having done in the past. And one of the really honest things in the book is this recognition, and again, you're writing in the context of trauma, but I think it's true of everybody, the way we all curate our own stories and edit our own stories and have versions of our life that reflect the best bits of ourselves. And what you're arguing here, obviously in the context of trauma, but I think it's got wider applicability, is the need for everybody to try to live authentically and find, and even if that means admitting that previous versions of their story that they might have told are not quite accurate. Now, that's something most people will do privately, or many people will not ever do it at all, but those who do will do it privately. And yet you again have kind of chosen to share it with everybody. Yeah, and I use the motif of being trapped in a drawing, trapped in your own painting. And so some of those what people see as contradictions is actually my resignation. That's the life now that I have.
That's the life that I've chosen. Whether I was fully aware of that choice or not, that's the path now that I'm on. And so there's a kind of, I guess, a kind of reluctant embrace of that, you know. And what could I do that for me would be creatively satisfying, feels honest, possessed integrity, but also was, you know, engaging for a reader. And it's difficult kind of getting all of that to line up. There's lots of other things that I'm interested in, and there's lots of other topics that I would hopeful to get the opportunity to tackle. But it seems like, you know, these 3 books are kind of related in a way where it's me dealing with becoming more known than I ever thought that I would be, and just grappling with that. In a sense, it is egotistical, just in the true sense, a dialogue you're having with yourself about you. But actually, while obviously some forms of egotism can be quite tedious and circular, I think if you have an awareness of that conversation, and a self-awareness and a willingness to really look at yourself, then you can actually create bodies of work that really engage your readers or audience in a very intimate way, because you're doing things that they sometimes want to do, but they've not seen someone else do it yet, or that you're asking yourself questions that people dare not ask themselves because they're frightened of the answer, but when they see someone else do it, then they think, maybe I'll give this a go. And so many writers and so many people in the community, in the recovery community in particular, James being one of them, that's what they modelled to me, you know. They modelled that to me. They showed me how to live a better life. And if you can do that in a book, then I think you're doing okay.
So, I mean, maybe my perspective is slightly coloured by the fact I've just written a memoir of my own, but for me, and I identify with a lot of what you said there, it's about almost feeling you have to kind of I had to tell my story in my words in order to almost give myself permission to move on in life. And I read this book and it felt to me as if you were doing likewise, that this was a book you wanted to write because it's got, you know, a lot to offer society generally, but it was a book you were writing for yourself, almost to give yourself a sense of liberation and permission to move on to another phase.
Yeah, and some people might, some people in the kind of therapeutic community might actually see that again as a sort of trauma, evidence of trauma, in terms of there's a thing that some of us do, which is they tell everyone everything because they think if they don't, they're being dishonest or inauthentic. And so there's a lot of subtlety about the book that people can chew over. But ultimately, I realised that whether I like it or not now, I kind of made my bed in terms of the relationship that I formed with my audience with the first book. And so I'm trying to kind of, I guess, with this book say, okay, I'm happy for us to have this relationship. I'm grateful for it. But I would like to maybe redraw some of the parameters because here are the things about this relationship that are very hard for me. You know, and going into some detail about what goes on behind the scenes. Sometimes when you're on TV talking about trauma and addiction, and behind the scenes you're getting blue lighted to the nearest hospital. Do you know what I mean? Because you're completely off your head.
I think trying to redraw these boundaries is a very healthy thing to do. We're going to come to the audience for questions in a moment. Just a couple more from me before we do so. So get your thinking caps on and hands in the air. Do you feel, because I closed the book when I finished reading it thinking or hoping that you did, but I got the sense that, well, I'll just ask you the question, do you feel a bit liberated having written this book?
Yeah, I felt liberated because I know that anyone who really knows me, if they were to read this book, which I suspect some of them won't, then it would be, of all of the work that I've produced, something that reflects me most accurately. And for me, as someone who has consciously or unconsciously traded on my experiences or authenticity, it becomes important, at least to me, as I try to live a more honest life, to make sure that if that story is out there, that the version of it is as close to being accurate as I can conjure from my own subjective experience. You know, in the past, there are things that are omitted, sometimes to save other people's face rather than my own. And then also, I didn't even realise that sometimes not including someone as part of your story could actually hurt them. You know, someone who played a key role in your life and you've left them out of the story because you think you're trying to protect them. And then they might think, well, I mean, did we not know each other all of that time? And then it's just like, I don't exist in your life anymore. All these things you don't think about. So it's like, in a way, you're kind of trying to clean up a little bit of a mess that you've made. A lot of it's in here, but still, it's got to be done. And in that sense, I felt like I was making amends in some ways for some of the ways that the first book kind of snapped back at me and others.
Well, as somebody who's a big fan of, was and is a big fan of Poverty Safari, I think this is your best book of the three.
Really?
Yeah, I do. One final... and
That's so nice to hear.
One final question for me, because I wanted to get to it earlier and I've not managed to, but it's a topic that fascinates me, both from my own perspective, but from talking to other people, is this, you know, whole thing about identity, how the things we choose to cling on to as part of our identity, whether that's class or gender or faith or whatever it is, can be so empowering in terms of our sense of ourselves, can also become really limiting if it becomes, well, I'm this, so I can't be that. Yeah. And it holds people back, it prevents growth and development. And I think that's one of the themes you explore really well in the book. You know, as a politician, you know, I have, you know, constituency surgeries. I'll often encounter people who are clinging to really negative things in their life because it's become such a core part of their identity that they feel if they lost that, it would be something being taken away rather than actually freeing them up. And that's such a complex thing.
Yeah, and I think the best way that I can show people that I understand that struggle is by, in that chapter you're referring to, cut to the very core of my identity, both privately and publicly, which is someone who's working class and who sees themselves as working class and who sees everything through a class lens, sometimes to the detriment of my own understanding of the world and myself. And so in that chapter, I spend it's a bit of a lengthy chapter, but I spend a lot of time just trying to unpack for the reader, almost like you're kind of softening them up before you sort of, not necessarily go in with a sucker punch, you're not trying to surprise them, but you're trying to say, look, I'm letting you know, I'm your friend, I understand, this is going to be difficult, but a lot of those things that you hold dear, those facets of your identity, these can become very limiting, particularly if you move from a sense of legitimate victimhood, i.e. something has happened, accountability must occur, healing must occur. If that doesn't occur though, you can move into a mindset where your brain, where it's riddled with trauma, begins to perceive everything that's happening as an attack or a threat. And I think sometimes we run the risk when we validate victimhood and those experiences of not practicing discernment between someone who has an understanding of the appropriate context of whatever it is that's occurred, and someone who has maybe crossed into a victim mindset, something I have done so many times in life, particularly as an addict, where a victim mindset becomes your whole justification and excuse for why you continue to use and burn your life and the lives of others to the ground. So I do talk from experience, but I realise it needs to be handled very, very delicately.
Yeah, well, I think you do it well. Right, we'll go to the audience for some questions, if there are any. Up at the back.
Thank you very much for the talk, really enjoyed it. You talk about the sort of commoditisation of the sort of lived experience, but do you have a kind of view of why that doesn't necessarily translate when we get that into the political sphere? You know, Keir Starmer rolled out the whole line about being the son of a toolmaker, and you know that sort of got spat back in his face. So do you have any sort of sense of why that lived experience lends legitimacy sort of online in the current time, but doesn't sort of extend into the political sphere as much as folks would maybe like it to?
Well, I don't know how much legitimacy the story of son of a toolmaker growing up in the Pebble Dash terrace or whatever the chat is. I don't know how much legitimacy it's got here in London, but not a lot of people outside of London take it very seriously. And I think it's not because it's not true. It's because it's a construction that someone else has come up with for Keir Starmer that they think is authentic because that is his experience. But it's not the sort of thing that he would say. It doesn't seem like the sort of person, the sort of thing that someone would say. I mean, even yesterday I was doing an interview with Politics Joe, and Ava, who was interviewing me, she was like, you know, we've all heard the expression growing up in a pebble dash, this and that. And I'm just sitting there like, no, we haven't all heard that. We haven't heard that. I don't know a toolmaker.
I mean, I did grow up in a house that was pebble dash, right? But we never ever
But that
described
expression,
it as that.
yeah, exactly.
I think, I mean, speaking as a politician, I think it's because too many politicians kind of too obviously are wearing these things as things that they think will give them legitimacy and authenticity. And, you know, that is Keir's backstory, but I don't think anybody believed every time he says that this has really, really shaped who he is. If that experience had really shaped who he is as a politician, he'd be doing a few different things as a politician right now, in my view. But anyway, I'm straying too far into politics.
Thanks for your question. Thanks for your question.
Cheers. Anyone else? Yep, we've got one here, and then over here.
Thank you very much. So when I think about the people that I know that are most traumatised, they don't have any language around trauma. They can't relate to it, and they wouldn't recognise that they are traumatised or that that trauma is having an impact. I was just wondering if you've got any thoughts on how you bridge that divide between somebody who's maybe not open to self-reflection around trauma and then others around them who do see it very clearly.
Yeah, and that's an important distinction. I touch on that a bit in the book, where actually the trauma discourse is sometimes dominated by people whose experience of trauma is not so severe that they've lost the capacity to articulate it, or that they've lost the capacity to understand it. And the flip side of that is that some of the most severe instances of trauma, because a person isn't a great storyteller or doesn't have a lot of insight, they don't get noticed. You've got a lot of people walking around and their baseline is PTSD, and they don't realise that what they think as a personality or particular tastes or likes is actually all different coping strategies to deal with that constant sense that something is just about to go catastrophically wrong. And I still live with that to a certain extent, although I have community and certain things around me where there's a level of attunement that soothes it. But how you open a dialogue with someone who actually has it and they're not aware of it, it's very, very challenging, and it will vary from individuals. But usually, if someone is operating at that level of trauma, they're going to eventually, some calamity is going to occur. And it's only really after that kind of rock bottom moment or calamitous moment where often a window of lucidity will open, where someone becomes a little more aware of the gravity of their situation, and that's when you need to act fast. It's a bit like that with addicts as well. They relapse, they get to jail, whatever it is. They have about a 48-hour period where they're like, I'm fucked, I need help. And unfortunately, sometimes we don't get the help they need there in time. So it's almost kind of, I guess it sounds kind of cynical or sinister. You're waiting for the opportunity to make your intervention in an appropriate way, because you know yourself, if you just dive in, all guns blazing, they're very efficient at keeping you at distance. Traumatised people, aren't they? Were you going to say something?
There's a line in the book, actually, which I'm not going to quote properly here from memory, but where you say something like you're less concerned about the fact that lots of people who are not traumatised are claiming to be traumatised than you are about the fact that lots of people who are still don't recognise it or can't express it. And
that would have been a better way for me to say it, actually.
No, well, you do say it like that in the book, but isn't that actually the bigger problem? That there's still lots of people who are genuinely traumatised, going through, you know, horrendous things that are just not knowing it, expressing it, or even if they are, not accessing the support and help they need. Yeah,
absolutely. And I mean, I'm just thinking, I don't know one woman in my life or community who doesn't have a serious trauma, you know, of some description. But also, it took them many, many years to even identify that that was a possibility for them, because some of the traumas that occur for women were happening at a time where that was all getting dismissed or suppressed or seen as normal behaviour. And so there's this kind of awakening to the wound, and also the legitimate grievance that you might have with a culture, an individual, or whatever. That whole process in and of itself, some people will find it empowering, other people, to really discover the magnitude of what you've been through, it's very, very difficult.
Do you think there is I mean, there is, because there is to almost everything in life, but the gendered element to trauma that we perhaps, this is a question, not a statement, I don't know what the answer is, but that we still think of trauma in terms of the things men experience, and there's a whole kind of female trauma often caused by traumatized men that we don't understand as fully or address as fully.
Yeah, absolutely. And then as I kind of touch on in the book through a lot of James's insights, often the level of traumatization is relative not just to the wound or the act of abuse or neglect, but it's also relative to culture and what norms are at a particular point and how they shift. So there's certain things in this country that children would be traumatized by because of where we are culturally. In some other countries, they might not be traumatized by those things. But if they moved from that country to this country, they might experience trauma as a result of that awareness. But the gender dimension to it is obvious and compounded by the fact that historically women have a hard time actually even advocating for themselves due to gender biases and things like that in healthcare systems, criminal justice and so on and so forth. So that's something that's maybe better for a female author, somebody with experience of that to say, but I feel comfortable saying as much as I did.
Okay, we had another question here and then come down here.
Yeah, thanks. Really, really interesting talk so far.
Do you really think that? Because that's the kind of thing a journalist says when they weren't paying attention.
Well, I'm from the BBC, and my question is, no, it's funny. It's really interesting.
Are you from the BBC?
Pardon?
Are you from the BBC?
No, I'm not from the BBC. No,
It would have been amazing if he was, wouldn't it?
I felt a trauma response suddenly to the fore there.
No, I'm actually a clinical psychologist who worked up in Scotland in Royal Edinburgh, Carstairs Hospital. So I've seen a lot of trauma, and now what I'm seeing is a lot of that's big T trauma. But like society now, people are getting exposed to lots of micro traumas, and particularly children, like with COVID, what they're exposed to in social media, and that's a little kind of like micro shocks to the central nervous system. And you mentioned social media, and my worry is just that that's being used to kind of numb stuff. So it's not allowing the nervous system to fire, and then we know it fired, and then we do something about it. It's kind of keeping it at a low level, like almost like pushing a beach ball underwater. And I'm a bit worried about what does that mean for the future, because also in that state, if you're in social media, you can sometimes be in a bit of a zombie state where you're susceptible to, safe, threat, right, wrong, victim, perpetrator, and like people on social media can take advantage of that, like influencers and stuff. So I'm just a bit, thoughts on that, kind of the younger generations.
Sorry, I think that's a really good question, and that's sort of what, even just taking social media, what that does to people's nervous system on a kind of day-to-day basis, I think is something that I'm not qualified to talk about, but I think I probably do experience it sometimes. Before I hand over to Darren, it reminded me, one of the things I maybe slightly disagreed about in the book was you, and correct me if I'm getting this wrong, but it seemed to me, maybe I was being hypersensitive, you kind of dismissed the idea that COVID was traumatizing for people. Is that fair?
I quoted James dismissing the idea that COVID was traumatizing for people, and his argument was that it wasn't traumatizing in the sense that we got into a national hysteria about, because it wasn't a secret. It wasn't something that was happening behind closed doors. Everybody was talking about it openly. So we were engaged in this very kind of public, almost sense of grief and mourning around it. And while obviously that there's maybe some aspects of that he's missed or that I'm not representing here. He was coming from a particular place where he was talking about the sort of trauma that is that much more acute because you're not allowed to talk about it, or that if you do talk about it, you're punished, or you suffer some kind of other reprisal. In terms of the pernicious influence of social media, it frustrates me to no end right now, where we constantly see certain commentators and activists acting as if people with brown and black skin represent the most dangerous cultural invasion that is happening since God knows when X isn't getting checked at the border, Facebook isn't getting checked at the border, Instagram isn't getting checked at the border. These are having the most radical effects on our culture, if you can call it that. They are impacting how we correlate. They're impacting how we see ourselves in our relationships. They're impacting intimacy, including physical intimacy. There is not one aspect of our culture that is untouched by the tentacles of transnational tech conglomerates. So when people want to have a talk about our culture being invaded or corroded and they're not talking about that, they are not fucking serious. And the level of trauma that someone must experience that is untreated, where they can be coerced or persuaded into thinking that the biggest threat that they face is immigrants, that's a whole other discussion about trauma, one that we don't have time to have tonight.
Hear, hear. Right, I think we've got time for maybe another couple of questions. So I'm going to take one here because I'd already promised one here, and then we'll take one over here and then see where we get to. I have completely lost track of time, so if somebody wants to tell me what time it is, that would be great. Right, okay.
Thanks very much. Really appreciate refreshing honesty. And I look forward to reading your book, Darren. I've been in education all my life. I've lived in London about 45 years. And the issue of trauma, it makes me think, linking to policy, Nicola, is there anything that we could be doing to better prepare young people for those critical thinking skills that clearly are necessary for people to better cope with the rubbish that's pumped out to them through social media? And indeed, is there anything that we could be doing in the delivery of curriculum that, for example, in Denmark, youngsters right through to high school age are taught how to empathise with other people, how to be more resilient, to be able to better cope with trauma? Is there anything that we could be doing that would help young people to cope better? That's my question, really, because it's linked to policy making as well as experience.
Do you want to go that first?
I think teaching, I'm not sure that's entirely the right word, but building resilience in young people is probably one of the most important things we've got to address, because of all of the pressures that are piled on young people these days. I worry a little bit, and have done for some time, that we're maybe going in the opposite direction a little bit, where young people have become much less resilient, without diminishing or underplaying mental ill health at all. The numbers of conversations I had with younger people when I was still in government office, and they would talk about certain things being mental health problems, when in actual fact what they were talking about were, stress over exams or falling out with a friend, the normal stresses and strains of growing up. And I do think there is a need in, Scotland's curriculum, for all its faults, because every curriculum has faults, is intended to accommodate, building. It's intended to be a curriculum that builds good citizens. So yes, I think there is scope to do that, and I think there's a real urgency about doing that, because that, I think, is, the world is a scary and challenging place, certainly more so than when I was growing up, and I think the need to build that resilience is definitely overwhelming.
But it's not valued. What's valued is jumping through exam hoops.
Yeah, and I think obviously people will naturally tend to look to Scandinavian, Nordic countries for examples of best practice in almost every area of how a society could be configured. The problem I have found or would anticipate for anyone who tries to overtly implement anything like that in the UK, maybe to a lesser extent Scotland currently, is that it just comes into this culture war that we have here, where that would be seen in the same light as cycle lanes or needle disposals, and it would become caught in this culture war gaze where it can't actually be honestly discussed and debated. Even though if you look at the results, I mean, Finland's the best place to look for examples of best educational practice. People in Finland would disagree. They're all panicked because they're like, oh my God, Singapore's #1 now. Do you know what I mean? Or whatever. But there they have just a completely different take on education, where it's all about relationships. You have the same teacher for multiple years. There's none of this sir, madam stuff. The teachers get called by their first name. They've got a more egalitarian kind of viewpoint of it, just because that's kind of who they are. But that's all been cultivated for decades, as well as being underwritten by a much more prudent management of their natural resources and all of the dividends that generates, whereas we don't have those luxuries, at least not in Scotland yet. Maybe one day, but we run this country like a cash and carry, you know, and it shows in the quality of our public services.
I think that point of the culture war is so important. We live in a time where everything that is even remotely progressive is getting caught up in, you know, it's just wokery, and there's massive backlash and pushback against it. And that actually speaks to the bigger challenge I think we all face right now. And politicians of the left and, you know, of a progressive mindset, you know, of political tradition that I come from, need to stop pandering to that and trying to outdo that. You know, Keir Starmer, stop trying to out Farage on things like immigration. Let's stand up again for progressive values and progressive politics. It might feel hard, but until we start doing it, then the Farages and the Trumps are going to continue to win the day, and that's not good for any of us, frankly.
Yeah.
Right, we had one question over here.
Now, listen, I'm going to ask you to think magic wand in a moment, but I have to say, when I looked on paper, both of you guys together, and a proliferation of Scottish accents here, I thought, that's an interesting mix, but I tell you what, you're a dynamic duo. No question. So, Darren, you've got depth. I felt the passion when you were talking about social media, felt it. Nicola, do not quit politics. I know you feel like it, but you've got the width. That width and depth combination is profound. Now, if you've got a magic wand, and I'll bring back young people because the stats are shocking. What we're doing to them is really disturbing. So if you got a magic wand, what would you do to change that outcome?
I always find it hard to whittle it down to one.
Give me 3 then.
Well, I mean, it's boring stuff, though, that's really quite structural. Do you know what I mean? So at UK level, it would be electoral reform. You need electoral reform. Because one of the problems that we've... So first, that's how you deal with the political crisis, partly, right? Because ultimately, the reason that someone like Farage can become such an effective insurgent is because he's unburdened, because he's not responsible for anything. So he can be more authentic. And that's the kind of thing that's initially endearing for an ordinary working class person. Whereas the main parties at kind of UK level, because there are so many new dimensions being introduced into an electoral calculation, then the main parties have to contradict themselves constantly to secure the electorally lucrative demographics in order to get the coalition they need to win the winner-takes-all imperative. And that means that the two big parties with the big infrastructure who really represent politics just look and sound fake as fuck. So that's what creates the ground for the insurgency. So electoral reform, and then obviously with education, I mean, the practicalities of doing this would be disputed, but I just think that people are going on and on and on about two-tier criminal justice in this country. I don't know if any of them have ever seen the inside of a prison, but the only two tiers that I see are the fact that it's full of working class people, and they're all being shipped there by middle class lawyers and judges. That's the two-tier that I see. It's the two-tier educational system that we really want to be getting a grip on, because the independent sector, 7% of people in this country are privately educated, but they hoover up over half of all of the opportunities in society, and they subtly steer society in a particular direction, even where there might be variability between them in terms of conservative or liberal. They have an overall economic outlook that surprisingly is in their own interests. So I would just bulldoze private education, bulldoze the House of Lords as well while you're at it.
Okay, that's 2. Give us 3.
Bulldoze the House of Lords. But I mean, I probably should still be a wee bit more politically diplomatic. I wouldn't bulldoze it, you know, metaphorically speaking. Definitely abolish it. Get rid of Trident. But I would say 2 things. I mean, I agree with electoral reform. I just think we've got to understand the limitations of that. Scotland's got a proportional representation system right now. That won't stop Farage ending up having MSPs after the election next year, unless something changes, which I hope it will. I would say 2 things, one political, one social policy. Politicians who are on the left who actually prepare to stand up for what they believe in and say it as it is. And there are just too few of those around right now. And the second one, how do you tackle poverty? You put more money into the pockets of people who are poor. And the policy I'm proudest of from my time as First Minister is something we do in Scotland and we don't do in any other part of the UK. It's called the Scottish Child Payment. And it puts money into the pockets of the poorest families in the country. And it's the reason why, before I say this, child poverty in Scotland is too high. But Scotland's the only part of the UK where child poverty is falling, not rising at the moment, and it's entirely down to the Scottish Child Payment. And if we can tackle child poverty, then we make kids more able to learn in schools and we improve education as well. So those would be my 2 things. And in terms of don't leave politics, I'm taking the Tony Benn approach to things. I'm stepping down from Parliament to spend more time in politics.
Very good.
I think are we out of time? We are. Right, Darren, I'm going to give the last word to you.
Okay, guys, listen, thanks so much, all of you, for coming. I think this is my first event in London, proper. So thanks. For those of you who came thinking it was Nicola's event, apologies. Thanks, though, anyway. And thanks to you for doing this. I'm not going to lie, and I was saying to everyone when you weren't in the room, I mean, I've bumped into Nicola a few times over the years. I was not expecting to be quite as nervous as I was when you went out. I was really nervous. I feel like I've suppressed some of my admiration for you in the intervening time when you became the boss of Scotland. And you've taken the odd pot shot at me as well, Darren. Come on. Anyway, he's brilliant. His book is brilliant. So if you haven't read it, and if you haven't got it yet, make sure you get a copy. You will not regret it. Give a big round of applause to Thanks,
Darren
guys.
McGarvey.